Just wanted to start the meeting off with a little word before we sort of get underway by way of encouragement. And it's a story that comes from 1 Samuel chapter 30. Most of you will probably know it if you do your Bible readings, but it's the story of the time of King David. He had a lot of supporters, he had an army effectively, and he'd been very successful in his campaigns. And his hometown of Ziklag, while he was away working for the Lord, as it were, got invaded by the Amalekites. And they took everything. They looted the town, they took away their wives and everything. And they came back to their hometown of Ziklag and found this had happened. And of course, this was a major, major tragedy, not only for David, but for his men. And his men were so upset by it that they thought of stoning David. Great. Your own army, your biggest supporters, sort of shows their loyalty a bit. But during this time, David had nowhere to turn. Now, there's no record as well. Now, of course, God was there, but there's no record of God stepping up either in person or through an angel, coming to David and getting side by side by him and encouraging him. So God, as it were, and this is the way it seems, not obviously the way it is, but it would seem God had forsaken David. His men had forsaken David. So where do you go? Where do you go in times like that where your world sort of is falling around you? People that perhaps you've relied on, sadly, aren't there. And sometimes they don't do what David's men did in a bad sense. They're just not there. They just don't happen to be there to support you. And God, by virtue of a test, has, as it were, left you alone. What do you do when you've got God not to encourage you, friends, helpers, brethren, not there to encourage you? Well, you do what David did. And it says that David encouraged himself in the Lord. He encouraged himself in the Lord. And I don't know how many of us are at that place where we've learnt to do this. You know, sometimes Christians for many years, they've got so reliant on others around them, they've never learnt to do this. So my word of encouragement for us today would be to think about this principle and to learn to do this. Next time you have a little trial, and maybe you will have people around you who can encourage you, but before you go there, take a step in this thinking and encourage yourself in the Lord. Clearly, God wanted to teach David this because God, like I say, had sort of left him to it. He'd arranged a situation where his hometown had got invaded, the wives had been taken away, and David had nowhere else to go. So David encouraged himself. It really is, brethren, the sign of a mature Christian if you can stand alone in times like that and encourage yourself. So don't feel bad if you're not at that point yet or you've failed in doing that in the past. It's a new day today. And so this word is just to try and encourage us to go further in this subject, to learn to encourage ourselves. Now, in doing that, what did David do? Well, after we read that he encouraged himself in the Lord, you know the first thing he did? He went to Abiathar, the priest, and the priest, through the ephod, inquired of the Lord at the request of David. And David said to the Lord, Shall I go? Shall I go and try and invade the Amalekites and try and get our loot and our wives back? So that's how it all works. When you encourage yourself in the Lord, it's not just a matter of trying to summon up as much strength of faith that you have. It actually involves going to the Lord. He may seem distant to you. He may, as it were, have left you fearing to be alone, but he's there. And what he's doing is forcing you to do this. So do what David did. You go to the Lord and you inquire of him, Lord, what shall I do? And you see, that's an act of faith, which is part of encouraging ourselves in the Lord, lifting our faith to the point where we go to God and say, God, I don't quite understand why you've put me in this situation. And to be honest, it almost seems cruel. Think about it. His whole hometown looted, his wives taken away, and he didn't know whether they'd been killed or whatever at this stage. It almost seems mean, doesn't it, of God? And similarly, you remember the story with Jesus, with the Canaanite woman who came to Jesus seeking healing. In 4 different ways, the Lord rejected her. The disciples tried to make her go away. He got told by Jesus that he'd only come to minister to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He then went on to tell her that, well, he's not going to cast the bread to the dogs. In other words, referring to her as a Gentile dog, which was a common Jewish appreciation of Gentiles outside of the Commonwealth of Israel. What did this Canaanite woman do? She kept pressing in. She encouraged herself, and then she says to Jesus, yes, Lord, but even the dogs get the crumbs. So I don't need a lot from you, but you are so powerful. If I just get a few crumbs from you, that will be enough. So it's another example where, and we've talked about in David's case, how God the Father, this story with the Canaanite woman is an example of how his son Jesus did the same thing. Sometimes God, sometimes Jesus will appear, not in reality, but they will appear to be rude to us. They will appear to be severe to us. And it's designed to drive us further to inquire of him. So, brethren, remember that. Remember that, especially when you maybe don't have the people around you or even God himself. And it's like when you train somebody. Most of you have trained your children, or maybe you've trained teachers at school or people in your workplace, wherever, to do a new job, right? And to start with, they're ignorant. They don't know how to do the job. You hold their hand, you lead them step by step. You maybe give them a manual to follow, right? But sooner or later, you leave them alone, right? You can't hold their hand forever. They need to learn to do this job by themselves. And so you'll step back and you'll leave them to do the job. And sometimes they'll muck it up. They'll make mistakes. But if you jump in every time, they're not going to learn to do the job properly. They need to be left, try and do the job, make a mistake, have to come back to it, work out where they went wrong, and get to the conclusion. All right? And a good teacher will follow that process. And God the Father and Jesus exactly work like that with us. So if there comes a time in your life where you feel alone, like David, then remember that principle. You encourage yourself in the Lord, and the first thing you do is you inquire of the Lord. So that's our quick message for the day.